This isn't the Iran you think you know. This was a nation building skyscrapers, embracing freedom, and secretly spiraling towards chaos. Imagine Tehran in the early 1970s. It was a city buzzing with ambition and oil money. Women in Western fashions walked the streets. Modern architecture pierced the skyline, and the sounds of popular music spilled out from cafes. At the center of it all was one man, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He had a grand vision for his country, a future he called the Great Civilization. To achieve this, he launched a series of sweeping reforms in 1963, known as the White Revolution, a revolution intended to be bloodless. But why would a plan for progress, a revolution without red on its hands, ultimately set the stage for one of the most violent upheavals of the 20th century? On the surface, everything was working. Fueled by an ocean of oil revenue, Iran's gross national product was skyrocketing. A new educated middle class was emerging, attending universities and filling the ranks of a modernizing economy. But this glittering prosperity was a facade, a thin veneer stretched over deep societal fissures. For every Iranian enjoying a European holiday, there were thousands in rural villages and urban slums who saw none of this wealth. This new Iran felt alien to them, a betrayal of their traditions and their faith. And this growing resentment was about to find its voice, because behind the Shah's vision of modernity was an iron fist. Political parties were banned, the press was censored, and any form of dissent was ruthlessly crushed. This was the work of the Shah's infamous secret police, the Sazman-e Ettelaat va Amniyat-e Keshvar, known to the world as SAVAK. Their network of informants was everywhere. Fear was a constant, silent partner in daily life. But silencing dissent doesn't eliminate it. It just forces it into the shadows, where it can grow, mutate, and become far more powerful. The Shah, in his quest to build a secular Western-style nation, had alienated not just students and intellectuals, but the deeply religious heart of his country. And from his exile, thousands of miles away, one man was becoming the symbol for all of this simmering anger, a man whose name would soon echo across the globe. The party in Tehran was still going, the skyscrapers were still rising, but the foundation of the Shah's throne was cracking, ready to shatter. The world saw a partner, a pillar of stability in the Middle East, but they failed to see the storm that was gathering just beneath the surface. The White Revolution was his legacy. It became his downfall. The paradox is chilling. In 1963, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, stood at a crossroads. His nation, rich in oil and ancient history, was also grappling with deep-seated feudal structures and widespread poverty. He believed the only way forward was a radical top-down modernization. He called it the Enqilab-e the White Revolution. It was named White to signify its bloodless, peaceful intent. But history, as we know, is rarely so clean. What were these grand reforms, and how could a plan for progress plant the seeds of its own destruction? The revolution was a 19-point program, but its heart lay in a few key areas. The first, and most explosive, was land reform. The goal was to break the power of the old land-owning aristocracy by redistributing vast estates to the peasant farmers who worked them. On paper, it was a noble cause, a path to economic justice. But the reality was far more complicated. The implementation was often chaotic, and many peasants received plots of land too small to be sustainable. This created a new class of the rural poor, disconnected from their traditional support systems, and it opened a power vacuum that someone else would soon fill. Then came the social reforms. The Shah granted women the right to vote and hold public office, a move that seemed to align Iran with modern Western nations. He also established the literacy corps, sending young, educated Iranians into the countryside to teach reading and writing, combating an illiteracy rate that hovered over 80%. These were undeniably progressive steps. So why did they generate such intense backlash? The answer lies not just in what was being done, but in who was being ignored. The powerful Shia clergy saw the Shah's reforms as a direct assault. The land reform, for example, didn't just target feudal lords. It also seized the vast land endowments that funded the mosques, seminaries, and the clergy themselves. It was a strike against their economic independence. Furthermore, they viewed the new rights for women and the secular nature of the literacy corps as an importation of decadent Western values, designed to undermine Iran's Islamic identity. From their pulpits, a powerful narrative began to form. The Shah was not a modernizer, but an enemy of God. And one voice rose above all others in opposition. But the opposition was not only religious. Ironically, the very intellectuals and students who might have supported such progressive policies also turned against the Shah. Their grievance was not with modernization itself, but with the method. The White Revolution was not a democratic process. It was a decree from the throne. There was no debate, no parliament, no free press. Dissent was crushed by the Shah's feared secret police, the SAVAK. For Iran's secular nationalists and leftists, the Shah was replacing an old form of tyranny with a new, slicker version, all while selling the country's sovereignty to foreign powers like the United States. And so, the great paradox took shape. The Shah, in his attempt to build a modern secular state, had managed to do the unthinkable. He had pushed two groups who despised each other, the devoutly religious and the secular intellectuals, into an alliance against a common enemy, him. Each reform, intended to strengthen his rule, instead chipped away at its foundation. The peaceful revolution had created a powder keg, and the fuse had just been lit. This isn't just history. It's the untold story of how sound waves, not bullets, brought down an empire. In the mid-20th century, Iran was a nation undergoing a seismic transformation under its monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. His ambitious White Revolution brought land reform, literacy programs, and Western-style modernization, creating gleaming cities and a powerful military. But beneath this veneer of progress, a deep current of discontent was quietly growing. And how could one man, an exiled cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, possibly challenge a throne seemingly secured by oil wealth and the backing of the United States? The Shah's power depended on controlling the narrative through state-owned television, radio, and newspapers. Dissent was ruthlessly crushed by his feared secret police, the Organization of National Intelligence and Security, known as SAVAK. But in the 1970s, a new piece of technology was becoming common in households across Iran: the simple, cheap, and portable audio cassette tape. The regime saw these tapes as harmless devices for listening to music, completely unaware they were about to become the central weapon in an information war they could not win. From his modest home in exile, first in Turkey and then in Iraq, Khomeini began recording his sermons. These were not just religious lectures. They were fiery political indictments accusing the Shah of corruption, betraying Islamic values, and selling out the country to foreign interests. These master tapes were then smuggled into Iran, hidden in luggage or passed hand to hand by pilgrims and students. But how could a few smuggled tapes possibly reach a population of millions? Once inside Iran, a clandestine network sprang to life. In the back rooms of shops, in university dorms, and in private homes, a single master tape would be duplicated onto hundreds, then thousands of blank cassettes. This created a viral underground media ecosystem, a cassette culture that operated completely beyond the state's reach, spreading the Ayatollah's message like wildfire. But how do mere words spoken by a disembodied voice on a magnetic strip spark a revolution? For many Iranians, hearing Khomeini's voice was a profound experience. It was direct, unwavering, and felt deeply authentic, a stark contrast to the sterile propaganda of the state. People would gather in secret to listen, the shared act of defiance forging powerful bonds of community and a collective revolutionary consciousness. The tapes did more than just inspire, they instructed. Khomeini used them to call for specific strikes, boycotts, and street demonstrations, effectively becoming the remote control operator of a nationwide movement. When the Shah's forces inevitably responded with violence, the tapes would carry Khomeini's eulogies for the martyrs, calling on the people to observe the traditional 40-day mourning period, which would then culminate in another massive protest. The government was fighting a ghost. They could shut down a printing press or arrest a speaker, but how could they possibly silence a message that was being copied and shared in countless homes across the entire nation? By 1978, this relentless cycle of protest and repression, amplified by the cassette network, had brought Iran to a boiling point. The protests grew from thousands to millions, paralyzing the country. The Shah's once feared army began to fracture, its soldiers unwilling to fire on their own people who were chanting the words they too had heard on the tapes. The state's monopoly on information was shattered, and with it, its authority. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane and fled Iran, never to return. Less than 3 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini flew home to a rapturous welcome from millions. The cassette tape had proven that control of the narrative could be more powerful than control of an army, a lesson that would echo from the Arab Spring to the age of social media, forever changing the way we think about power, technology, and revolution. The moment a government's violence backfired so spectacularly, it guaranteed its own downfall. The definitive analysis. It never begins with a revolution in mind. It starts quietly, with a discontent that simmers just beneath the surface of daily life, a feeling that something is deeply wrong. For years, the people had endured, but a single, seemingly small act of state cruelty would change everything. But why this time? What made this one spark catch fire in a way that countless others had not? The first protest was not a tidal wave. It was a ripple, a few hundred students, then a few thousand citizens, gathering in a city square with simple, almost naive demands for reform. The regime, accustomed to absolute control, saw this not as a dialogue, but as a disease to be excised. Their response was swift and brutal, but they made a catastrophic error. They believed that the sight of their own citizens being beaten would terrify the rest into submission. It did the exact opposite. The grainy footage and hushed stories of the crackdown did not inspire fear. they inspired rage. The first funerals were held, and these solemn processions of grief morphed into the next, much larger wave of defiance. The government was now facing a cycle it could not comprehend, a terrible arithmetic of its own making. But how could mourning become a more dangerous weapon than any bomb or barricade? The regime responded to the funeral marches with even greater force, creating more victims, which in turn led to more funerals, each one larger and more furious than the last. A traditional 40-day mourning period became a recurring, predictable flashpoint for mass mobilization. The state was now trapped in a deadly rhythm it had initiated, a feedback loop of violence and resistance that was spiraling out of its control. The original demands for reform were long forgotten. The only chant now was for the government to fall. With each crackdown, the state was not just losing control of the streets, it was losing the psychological war. Fear, the primary tool of any authoritarian regime, was being burned away by shared grief and a collective sense of purpose. A population that has lost its fear is a population that can no longer be governed. But as the crowd swelled from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands, the regime had one last card to play: the loyalty of its security forces. What happens when the men with the guns are ordered to fire on their own people, on their own future? In the final days, millions poured into the capital. The regime issued its ultimate command: clear the streets at any cost. Tanks rolled, soldiers took their positions, and for a breathless moment, the entire nation stood on the precipice of a massacre. And then, nothing. A soldier lowered his rifle. Another laid a flower in its barrel. The orders from the top were met with silence from below. In that moment, the government ceased to exist. It had not been defeated by a foreign army or a rival faction, but by the unstoppable power of its own people, whose grief it had fatally underestimated. What if I told you a single afternoon of gunfire erased centuries of loyalty? This is the story of how a monarchy, which had stood for 2,500 years, sealed its own fate in a matter of hours. The date was September 8, 1978, a day that would forever be known in Iran as Black Friday. The months leading up to this day were filled with a growing storm of discontent against the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Protests were becoming more frequent, but many still held out hope for reform, for a path to a constitutional monarchy. But what could possibly push an entire nation from protest to a point of no return? The day before, on September 7th, a massive, peaceful demonstration had filled the streets of Tehran. For the protesters, it felt like a victory, a sign that their voices were finally being heard by the powerful regime. But for the Shah's government, the sight of millions marching in unity was not a sign of dialogue. It was a terrifying threat to their very existence. And so, in the dead of night, they made a decision that would change the course of history. What was this fateful order, given while the city slept? As dawn broke on Friday, thousands of people, unaware of the government's overnight decree, began gathering in Jaleh Square. They believed they were participating in another day of protest, but they were walking into a trap. The government had declared martial law, banning all demonstrations, but in an era before instant communication, most of the crowd had no idea they were now breaking the law. Suddenly, soldiers blocked the exits to the square. The protesters were surrounded, with military helicopters now circling low overhead. A warning was given, but the people stood their ground, chanting. The commanders gave the final order. But would these soldiers, fellow Iranians, actually fire on their own people? The answer came in a deafening roar of automatic weapons. The square descended into chaos and bloodshed. The official government death toll was 88, but eyewitnesses and opposition groups reported a far more horrifying number, claiming hundreds, perhaps even thousands, had been killed or wounded. The true number remains debated, but the effect was absolute. The massacre shattered any possibility of compromise. Before Black Friday, the call was for reform. After Black Friday, the call was for revolution. The slogan, "Death to the Shah," became the unifying cry. This brutal crackdown, intended to crush the opposition, instead galvanized it, uniting secular students, bazaar merchants, and religious followers with a single, unshakable purpose: the centuries of loyalty to the throne, the image of the Shah as the father of the nation, was irrevocably destroyed. It had been washed away in a single afternoon of blood, setting the stage for the final collapse of the monarchy, just 156 days later. The moment the Shah lost his grip was not on the streets, filled with protesters. It was in the quiet, cavernous halls of the oil refineries, and the numbers, the cold, hard economic numbers, do not lie. By the autumn of 1978, Iran was already a nation simmering with open revolt. But while the world watched the clashes in the city squares, the truly decisive battle was being waged elsewhere, in the economic heart of the regime. It began not with a bang, but with a walkout. In September, government ministry employees, bank tellers, and customs officials began a series of rolling strikes. These actions were more than just a nuisance. They were a calculated strangulation of the state's administrative functions. But how could these disparate groups possibly bring a powerful, modernizing monarchy to its knees? The answer lay in a single, vital industry. On October 31st, the workers in Iran's all-important oil sector joined the strikes. This was the moment everything changed. For decades, Iran's black gold had funded the Shah's military, his infrastructure projects, and his lavish lifestyle. It was the bedrock of his power. And suddenly, the men who operated the wells and the refineries simply put down their tools and walked away. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. In a matter of weeks, Iran's oil production plummeted from nearly 6 million barrels a day to under 1 million. The supertankers that once lined up in the Persian Gulf now sat empty. The state's revenue, its very lifeblood, was cut off at the source. But with the Shah's famously ruthless secret police and the might of the imperial army, why couldn't he just force the workers back? The regime tried everything. They offered massive pay raises and bonuses, which were rejected. They declared the strikes illegal and threatened mass arrests, which only strengthened the workers' resolve. They even attempted to bring in foreign technicians to run the refineries. But the sheer scale of the operation and the solidarity among Iranian workers made it impossible. The strikers were no longer listening to the Shah. They were taking their orders from a series of strike committees, which in turn looked for guidance from one man, the exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From Paris, Khomeini declared that the strikes must continue until the Shah left the country. With the treasury emptying and the nation grinding to a halt, the Shah's authority evaporated. He could no longer pay the army that was supposed to protect him or the civil servants who were supposed to run his government. In a final desperate act, he appointed a civilian prime minister, and on January 16, 1979, he boarded a plane and flew out of Iran, never to return. The Shah had lost his throne long before he left the country. He lost it when the oil stopped flowing, when the silence in the refineries became louder than the roar of the crowds. It was a testament to the ultimate power that, in any nation, comes not from the guns of soldiers, but from the hands of its workers. The moment the Shah stepped onto the tarmac, the future of an entire region changed forever. How did it come to this? By late 1978, Iran was a nation boiling over. The streets of Tehran, once a symbol of the Shah's modernizing ambitions, were now choked with millions of protesters. Their chants were a unified roar for one thing: an end to 2,500 years of monarchy. Inside the Nayavaran Palace, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the self-styled King of Kings, was increasingly isolated, weakened not just by the revolution at his doorstep, but by a secret, debilitating cancer he had concealed from his own people. His once unshakable grip on power was slipping, and the world was watching. But what could a cornered monarch possibly do next? In a desperate gamble to appease the masses and salvage his throne, the Shah made a series of concessions. He replaced military generals with civilian leaders and promised free elections. His most significant move came in the final days of 1978, when he appointed a longtime critic of his rule, Shapur Bakhtiar, as the new prime minister. It was a shocking choice, a last-ditch effort to create a constitutional monarchy and calm the storm. But was it enough, or was it already too late? The appointment of Bakhtiar failed to quell the unrest. For the revolutionaries, it was a meaningless gesture. The true leader of the opposition, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, denounced Bakhtiar from his exile in Paris, calling for continued strikes and protests. The military, the very foundation of the Shah's power, began to fracture, with soldiers deserting or declaring their neutrality. The Shah was out of options, and his American allies, particularly the administration of President Jimmy Carter, were sending confused and contradictory signals. The press. That decision came in early January 1979. The Shah would leave Iran. Officially, it was framed as a temporary vacation, a chance for the new government to establish itself. But in the halls of power and on the streets, everyone understood the truth. This was not a vacation. It was an exile. On the cold morning of January 16, 1979, the Shah and his wife, Empress Farah, arrived at Mehrabad Airport. The mood was somber, heavy with the weight of history. A few loyal officials and military leaders were there, many of them openly weeping. As he prepared to board the Royal Boeing 707 named the Shaheen, the Shah spoke his last words on Iranian soil, expressing his hope that his departure would prevent further bloodshed. He then walked up the stairs, a trained pilot taking the controls of his own plane, a final symbolic act of control in a situation where he had lost all of it. As the jet lifted off, it carried not just the last king of Iran, but the end of an entire era. The moment the news broke, Tehran erupted not in violence, but in euphoric celebration. People flooded the streets, honking horns, handing out sweets, and tearing down the Shah's statues. They saw his flight as a victory, the definitive end of tyranny. But for Prime Minister Bakhtiar, it was a catastrophe. The man who had appointed him was gone, leaving him completely alone to face the imminent return of the Ayatollah. The Shah's departure had not ended the crisis. It had created a power vacuum, and something far more radical was about to fill it. What if one single historical event explains virtually every major geopolitical crisis in the Middle East over the last 40 years? It does, and it started in 1979. On February 1st of that year, a chartered Air France Boeing 747 descended through the clouds over Tehran. On board was a man who had been in exile for 15 years, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Millions of people flooded the streets to welcome him, a sea of humanity stretching for miles. But this was not the end of the revolution. It was the beginning of something entirely new and far more radical than anyone, even many of his own supporters, could have possibly imagined. In the chaotic days that followed, Iran was a power vacuum. The provisional government, led by the moderate Mehdi Bazargan, tried to steer the country towards a democratic future. But Khomeini had other plans. He established parallel institutions, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Revolutionary Courts, which answered only to him, creating a government within a government. This set the stage for a brutal internal struggle for the very soul of Iran. Who would win this contest for power? The answer would come swiftly and decisively. In late March 1979, a referendum was held, and the choice presented to the Iranian people was stark: monarchy or an Islamic republic. With over 98% of the vote in favor, the Islamic Republic was officially born. But what did that actually mean? The new constitution, drafted by clerics, would provide the answer. It enshrined a concept called velayat-e-faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, concentrating ultimate political and religious authority in the hands of one man, the supreme leader, Khomeini himself. The dreams of a democratic Iran were evaporating, and a new crisis was about to erupt that would set Iran on a collision course with the West. That crisis exploded on November 4th, 1979. A group of radical students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. Their demand was the return of the Shah, who was in the United States for medical treatment, to stand trial. The hostage crisis lasted for 444 agonizing days, poisoning relations between the two nations for generations. But its internal impact was even greater. It solidified the power of the hardliners, destroyed the remaining moderates, and broadcast a new militant form of political Islam to the world. And it would directly inspire another, even longer and bloodier, conflict. Watching the chaos in Iran, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein saw an opportunity. In September 1980, he launched a full-scale invasion, hoping to seize oil-rich territory and crush the revolution. He miscalculated catastrophically. The invasion united Iranians behind Khomeini, turning a political revolution into a national war of survival. The Iran-Iraq War would rage for 8 brutal years, costing over 1 million lives. It became a proxy war, with the Soviet Union and eventually the United States tilting towards Iraq. This brutal conflict would not only militarize the Persian Gulf, but also create the very condition that would lead to future wars, including Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The seeds of the next 40 years of conflict were being sown in blood. Khomeini's death in 1989 did not end the Islamic Republic. The system he created, a unique theocracy with a powerful military and a global revolutionary agenda, endured. The legacy of 1979 is in the nuclear standoff with Iran, the proxy wars in Syria and Yemen, and the enduring rivalry with Saudi Arabia. It is in the very existence of groups like Hezbollah, funded and inspired by the Iranian model. The revolution that began with chants for freedom ultimately created a system that isolated Iran and destabilized an entire region. The aftershocks of that single event continue to shape our world today, a powerful and often tragic reminder of how one year can change the course of history forever.